Okay, so we are in part 3 of our 3-part seminar on the Holy Land, recounting the places that my wife and I visited this last May. Where we left last week, we had talked about Jerusalem. We'd seen most of the sights of Jerusalem. Now we're going to finish that up by following in the footsteps of Jesus during his Passion. So we begin on the Mount of Olives, where, of course, that story begins on Maundy Thursday, on the evening of Thursday after the supper, after the Last Supper. He went out to the hillside outside of the city to pray. So we're going to be talking about the Mount of Olives. So we've gone across the Qumran Valley from where we were in Jerusalem. You can see in the distance the Dome of the Rock, right? That helps us get our bearings on where the Temple Mount would have been from this hillside. If you go over the hill to the other side, that's where the desert begins. We're not that far from it. It's a fairly dry place, Jerusalem. The slope facing Jerusalem has been a Jewish graveyard for 3,000 years, so they're very old graves here. About 150,000 people buried here. Jewish Midrash, that's the commentary of the rabbis, claims that when the resurrection of the dead begins, it will start here. Like literally, geographically, here with the people buried here. And so the best plots sell for crazy numbers, and I saw a bunch of different ones. Our guide said one number. I saw some other ones thrown around online. Suffice it to say, none of us are being buried in this cemetery. Number one, you have to be, of course, Jewish to be buried here, but also it's out of our price range because people want to be first to be resurrected. I'm pretty sure no one else is waiting much longer, so I'm not worried about it. But that is an interesting tidbit and a reason why there's a huge cemetery on the other side of Jerusalem. Luke chapter 21, each day Jesus was teaching at the temple, and each evening he went out to spend the night on the hill called the Mount of Olives. Many times Jesus was here. All right, when he was in Jerusalem, for the various times he was in Jerusalem, when he wasn't in Bethany staying with Martha and Lazarus and Mary or some other place, this is a place that he would come, which again makes a lot of sense, right? The city didn't have a lot of extra housing in it, so if you are a pilgrim, a visitor for Passover, for one of the other holidays, you might stay in one of the villages nearby, and the Mount of Olives is right there. We saw this as we were walking around on the hill of the Mount of Olives. It's called a Jerusalem thorn. Speculation, this could be the plant that the crown of thorns was made out of. Nothing, of course, definitive, but this grows here, and they certainly seem to be significantly sized thorns. That would, of course, be quite painful. On that same hillside, they call it the Mount of Olives, are really ancient olive trees. And by ancient, I mean some of these trees are 1,500, 1,700 or more years old. They're not exactly sure, but they're very, very old trees. This is not all that uncommon. In Greece, there are trees that age to the time of Christ as well. So we're not too surprised by that. Olive trees, unless you completely uproot them, they are hard to kill. And even after they've looked like they're about done, they can have another generation. And so you can still see that these are flowering and live trees, old as they may be. This is the traditional site of Jesus' Passion on this side of the hill. Of course, we have no idea where exactly on the hill they were, how far up the hill, how far left, how far right? There were a lot of olive trees on this hill back in the day, and so they were here somewhere. Mark 14:32, they went to a place called Gethsemane, and Jesus said to his disciples, "Sit here while I pray." One of the things that you're noticing if you're sitting on this hill of the Mount of Olives, the city of Jerusalem is right over there. You can see it. right? You're out of town, so you've got a little bit of peace, a little bit of quiet. It'd be dark here, but the city is right there. The temple, when it stood, would have been more than visible from this grove of olive trees. Jesus would have known, tomorrow I will be in the city. Just to the side of those olive trees is the Church of All Nations, also known as the Basilica of the Agony. It's a modern church, 1920, but it's built on the site of a 4th century Byzantine basilica, which was destroyed by an earthquake in the 8th century, and a 12th century Crusader chapel. Again, so we've seen that repeated over and over again, right? Early Byzantine, destroyed 7th, 8th, 9th century, right, by various Muslim armies, or by an earthquake. There's a whole lot of that too. Rebuilt by the Crusaders, and if that one still stands, or one that's rebuilt on the site. So that is a common thing. When you go inside, there are a couple of very nice drawings on the ceiling and on the dome. But people go into this basilica in order to see this. It's the centerpiece of the church. Again, we saw the church at Tabgha, where they had the rock right underneath the altar, right? We saw in the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, where they had an altar right above the stone, and we'll look at that when we're looking at the Via Dolorosa in a minute. This is the same kind of thing. It's bedrock, all right? So this is down to ground level. And maybe this is the rock on which Jesus prayed, or maybe it was one a little further, in one direction or another. But there was a rock around here somewhere that he leaned upon, or he sat upon while he was praying. Of course, as he fell due to the moment. And so people come here and they kneel and they put their hand on the rock and they pray. This is what we see all over Jerusalem, people wanting to have that connection to one of these sites. Any questions about the Mount of Olives? A lot of things happen there in the Gospels, right? And certainly this is the beginning. So this is the hill upon which, right, Jesus is praying with his disciples, and then across the Qumran Valley, you would have seen they would have, in all likelihood, seen the torches coming of the party that Judas was leading. They wouldn't have been hard to miss, right, coming out of the temple area and then across the valley in the night. That's the Qumran Valley. You can see the walls of Jerusalem, how steep it is in that respect. It's a decent valley. There would have I've seen some drawings where there were bridges. There was a bridge across there. Of course, everybody has different theories about exactly how ancient Jerusalem was laid out, but certainly today it is still sort of in its fairly natural state, right? Nobody is putting houses in the bottom of this valley. They're on the slopes around it. And there still are olive trees and the rest growing there. So where do they go after the arrest, right? They take Jesus to the house of Caiaphas, and that is traditionally this location. The Church of St. Peter in Galakantu, which is not as cool in Latin as it doesn't sound as fancy. It's the Church of the Cockcrow, the church where the rooster crowed. Basically is what it's called in Latin. And this is once again a modern church with that same story. It's the traditional site of Caiaphas' house. A Byzantine church was built here in 457, so early. In 1010 it was destroyed, same reason as all of the other ones. Rebuilt by the Crusaders in 1102 and destroyed again in 1219. A chapel was allowed to be built there in 1300, but eventually it fell into ruins because it just wasn't as important a site as some of the other ones. It didn't have the people willing to keep it up. And so now this church was built in 1931. We're going to go inside in a minute and see things that date back to the time of Christ that are inside the church now. which would have been inside the Crusader church, which would have been inside the Byzantine church, same thing. But I took this picture because you can see just on the other side, just south of Jerusalem, look how close it is, the barrier wall, the wall that was built recently in order to separate the West Bank from Jerusalem. All right, that's the barrier wall that we passed through when we went to Bethlehem for a day and then passed back through. So just, I mean, you're in Jerusalem and you're saying, how far away is the West Bank? It's right there, a couple of miles. You can see it, it's right there, which is one of the reasons why, of course, Jerusalem is in such a tense position geographically in the modern, right, in the current strife, is because it is so close to all of these things, these borders and whatnot. So if you turn around, that's facing south. If you turn around from the church and look north, there you can see some of the ruins of the earlier churches. You can see how close we are at Caiaphas's house to the Temple Mount, just up the hill, and to the Mount of Olives just across the valley. And you're saying to yourself, why are we outside the city walls? Again, the city walls in Jesus' day extended much further south than they do today. All right, the modern walls extend further north and west. The ancient walls extended further south. And so this would have been within the city walls, as would have, we were at the tomb of David last week, right? And we looked at the traditional site of the Last Supper, both outside the city walls now, inside the city walls then. So this is a more, we are closer, again, because this isn't the part of the city that's been built up the last 2,000 years. We're outside the city walls from this site. And so Matthew 26:57, then those who had seized Jesus led him to Caiaphas, the high priest, where the scribes and the elders had gathered. You can see how far they walked from the Mount of Olives. Not that far, would have taken a little while. And then when they took him up to see Pilate, at the Antonian fortress, that would have been on the far side of the Temple Mount from here. So a decent enough walk, but doable, obviously, given the time. So what is inside this house, which became Basilica, which became a Crusader church, which is now a modern church? This is the reason why the site is important. So the building is modern. The basement has a guard room and a cistern. Cisterns, of course, for holding water, very common in the Middle East because it's very dry. You've got to hold on to the winter rains and save them for the rest of the year. But cisterns end up becoming other things as well. And in this case, the cistern became a dungeon. And this may have been the place where Jesus was held while he was awaiting his execution. Right? Because they convict him, they sentence him to death, but they can't take him to Pilate until the morning because Pilate doesn't do, right, 4 a.m. Meetings or whatever. It's not when you bother Pontius Pilate. And so this would have been perhaps the one. It's in the right location. It's of an ancient time, and certainly the Byzantines thought it was the right one. So it is quite a thing to go down into there. And there's also the added likelihood that Peter and John were held here, because in Acts chapter 5, Peter and John are held overnight awaiting trial, but they are miraculously freed before, and then the Sanhedrin finds them in the temple courts again preaching. You can see up above in the hole above this cistern that the Byzantines carved crosses into it. And certainly when the archaeological work was done, they were realizing, yes, this is the site of that Byzantine church, because this is one of those things that you can see that proves that. And you can also see there were windows for the guards to be able to look down into the cistern and see who was down in, or what was happening in there, without having to go down the steps into it themselves. And then, of course, right outside the modern church is the traditional site of Peter's denial in the courtyard of Caiaphas's house. And if this is correctly identified as Caiaphas's house, then this is the right place. Matthew 26:69, now Peter was sitting outside in the courtyard, and a servant girl came up to him and said, "You were also with Jesus, the Galilean." And of course, eventually, after his 3 denials, Peter breaks down, and so you have some modern sculpture on the door and in the courtyard to commemorate that. Questions about Caiaphas's house. So we started on the eastern side of Jerusalem on the Mount of Olives. Now we're on the south side of Jerusalem. We're going to go all the way to the north side of Jerusalem to the start of the Via Dolorosa in just a moment. All right, no questions yet, but hopefully we'll get some in a minute. Just to continue the theme that I started before, this is the group that went with us the second night when we wandered into Jerusalem on our own. And you see some different folks were brave enough to follow me. I think they saw that the first group all came back and said it must be okay. And so we are going to follow, and I've got a picture of each stop along the way, the Via Dolorosa, the way of suffering in Latin. This is an 18th century route. All right, this route does not date back to the time of Christ because, of course, it can't. Because, as we've mentioned before, in the time of Christ, all of this pretty much is outside the city walls. Now it's in the middle of the old city. So eventually, in the 18th century, they said, well, as the Stations of the Cross were by then a very popular Easter Good Friday kind of thing, and pilgrims were coming, they said, well, we've got to establish where are these spots. And as you will see, most of them, there's a church there, there's something already there that is the traditional site, and so they were just working with that. And so take a look at the map on the bottom left. Obviously, that's a drawing. That's not a picture or anything. But it would show you that at the time, they started at the Antonian fortress, which of course is not there anymore, wound through the city streets, out the gate, and then to the hill of Golgotha. All of it is now in the middle of this city. And so we will see that. This is number 1, station number 1, and I'll just tell you what the title of the station is. You know what happens there. When we do the Good Friday crosswalk here in Franklin, we have readings for each station that explain it a little bit further. This is the first station. Jesus is condemned to die by, of course, Pontius Pilate. It's called the Church of the Condemnation. Pretty straightforward in that respect. Right nearby here is what is known as the Lithostrotos, which in Greek is the stone pavement. This is underground. This underneath a convent. You go in, you go on down some steps, and you're underground. But of course, underground means where the ground was in the first century. And so these are paving stones. I told you there was like only one spot as you're walking around Jerusalem where you can see the old stones, right? Because they dug them up and they put them on the modern level. Well, this is where they used to be. Down all of those steps, you get down to the level that Jesus would have walked. And it was somewhere around here where in John 19:13, Pilate brought Jesus out and sat down on the judge's seat at a place known as the stone pavement. This was excavated in 1857, and we found, I didn't get a good picture of it, but remember when I showed you that stone at Caesarea Maritima that they had carved the board game into? There's one of those in the floor here. So that does lend credence to the fact that this was a place where soldiers would have hung out, because bored soldiers on guard duty see a stone pavement and say, you know what, we could turn this into a board game. And they make it there and they play while they're off duty or on duty, depending on how their officers are. And so this is a place where we connect again to where Jesus walked. We're way underground. We've got to go back up the stairs to continue the Via Dolorosa. So this is right nearby Station 1 underground. Station 2 is actually just across the courtyard from the first one. There's two churches sharing the same courtyard. Station number 2 is the Church of the Flagellation, which is the fancy term for the scourging, the whipping, where Jesus is made to bear his cross. In that courtyard, you go out, I looked up and I saw something that I thought was instructive. Because as is the case in the Old City and through much of the Holy Land, Muslims, Jews, and Christians live side by side. And as our guide told us, most of us don't get into this whole, people are not arguing, we're not fighting, we're just living our lives. Obviously, some of that has changed since October in that respect. But across the street, literally, from these two churches is a Muslim school. So you've got the spire with the crescent moon on the top in the background, and in the front, you've got two churches. They share a street. That's the way it is in Jerusalem. Churches, synagogues, and mosques all over the place. Station 3, so you're starting to walk towards the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, Jesus falls the first time. And these were installed some time ago in Jerusalem, these bronze figures on the walls with the Roman numerals so that people can stop and do what they want to do, say the prayers, do the readings, whatever. And you can see that 3 and 4 are right next to each other here. It's an Armenian Catholic church on the left. On the right is station number 4. Jesus meets his mother at the Church of Our Lady of Sorrows. And so these are right next to each other around that corner. This is actually the spot where those paving stones were, right outside here next to these two stations. You start working your way up the hill. You get number 5. Simon of Cyrene is made to bear the cross. And again, at some of these, there's nothing here. It's just you're walking on a city street. There's a plaque on the side. If you're not paying attention, you might walk right by it. But the rest of them are at churches. 6, Veronica wipes Jesus' face. Again, the only thing here is that. 7, Jesus falls for the second time. You can see someone had some older things and then they put these new plaques up, which are actually very nice. To show you what you experience, this is one of the streets for the Via Dolorosa in the Old City. You can see they've got steps on the outside and then the little ramps in the middle. One of the men in our group wasn't paying attention at one point and thought he was walking down the ramp part and actually was on the step part, nearly face planted it. So fortunately he stumbled into someone else that caught him, or we'd have been found out where the ER is near there. But see how narrow these streets are, right? Imagine coming here on Good Friday and trying to walk from Station 1 to Station 14. I can't imagine on any normal year when there's not a war going on how packed it is. Because there are tour groups walking this route every day. We saw a number of them, like ours, when we walked it as a group. And so no doubt it would be just jam-packed with people. Station 8, the women of Jerusalem weep over Jesus. And then when we get towards the end, we've got 9, which is Jesus falls for the third time at St. Helen Coptic Church. And I don't know if everyone knows what that means. The Copts, C-O-P-T-S, the Coptic Church, they're in Egypt. It's an ancient church. They theologically broke away from the church over the definition of the nature of the combination of Jesus' divinity and humanity. That was one of the things the early church argued about. How do those two natures come together? What is the combination of them? So the Copts have been apart from the main church story for many, many centuries. This goes back to the 400s. And so there's still a vibrant church in Egypt, and we hear about the Coptic church or the Copts, C-O-P-T-S. That's who they're talking about. And they have a sizable presence in Jerusalem and in the Holy Land, of course, right nearby. And so there's this church. We weren't able to go in, but that other station is there. But you can see we are literally on the other side of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, because the dome is right there on the other side. There's an Ethiopian church in between as well that we actually walked through once. That was kind of weird. We're kind of like, and people were doing it. We're like walking through their church to get from this side to that side, and it seems kind of weird, like people walk through my yard to cut the corner. If people went in this door and went out the front door because it was shorter, you'd be like, hey, we got a church going here, which is kind of odd. So you get to the last stations, 10, 11, 12, 13, and 14, all inside the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. We looked at these pictures when we were talking about the church, but I wanted to put them in this context. Up the steps is where station number 10 is. For whatever reason, it was closed while we were there. 11, you go in the doors, and up to the right, Jesus is nailed to the cross. That's the Catholic altar there, and right next to it is the Greek and Armenian one. They take turns there at station 12, where Jesus dies on the cross, and you can see the glass over the stone that they believe is where the cross was put into. And the priest, as I mentioned before, that was more than a little bit annoyed by how touristy some of the people there were being when we visited. And you want to just be like, cut it out, right? But that is what it is. Right below station 13, Jesus is taken down from the cross, and again, there is the stone that traditionally is the site on which his body was prepared. People come there, they kneel, they put their hand on the stone and pray. And once again, we have all of these lamps hanging everywhere. Not as many as in the Church of the Nativity, but an awful lot of them in this building. And then you turn around the corner about 20 yards away, and you have the building, the little mini building that was inside the church that was built to house the rock that they believe was part of the rock rolled away. So that's station 14. Jesus is placed in the tomb. And again, there's a line there every day, right? The building is closed overnight, but every day when it's open, people are going in and out of this, in and out of this, in and out of this all day long. One of the things that we discovered, and then I'll stop after this one here, is that right next door there was a chapel. And I don't know if I mentioned this last time. My wife was very happy to see that they were starting a mass when we were there on that second tour into the city on our own. So we had time, and she's like, I'm just going to go in. And it turned out it wasn't in English, of course, and so she made do. But I thought that the Stations of the Cross they had on the side of the wall, I don't know where they got that from, but I thought that was really beautiful. Again, it's inside this building, right? The Church of the Holy Sepulchre. It's all that I showed you that floor plan. You've got the Armenians, the Greek Orthodox, you've got the Catholics. Everybody's sharing this space. It's all very intricate. This is our space. This is your space. Right? The shared spaces, there are rules. This is what we do in the shared spaces. And there's a schedule and all of that. It's quite crazy. But again, you can understand why. Because being the caretakers of the Church of the Nativity or the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, there's a lot of prestige there. Right? There's a lot of honor that comes with that. And none of them want to cede it to the others. Questions about the Via Dolorosa?
On station 14, where they had that building, did you go down and under where they had some, like, satellite?
Yep. Yeah, it's not underground. It's right on the floor level. You go in that little tiny door. Again, all the doors at these places are so small. So I hunch down, go in there. It's about... It's called the Audicule in Latin. Anyway, it's like, what did I say? Maybe 8 feet by 6 feet by 5 feet. I mean, it's like a small jail cell, and there's the rock there, and people bend down and they put their hand on it because it's supposed to be the rock that the angel rolled away, or a portion of it. It's not a whole big rock. And you're in there for 30 seconds, and then the priest that's in there's one directing traffic going in and out, because you got to go out the same door that you came in. So people go in, and then you got to wait for them to come out, and then another group goes in, 3 or 4 people at a time. He gives you 30 seconds, and he's like, I mean, that's what they do. That's what those guys do. They take turns doing that, because it's important to keep order and to keep people moving. Otherwise, obviously, it would be a real mess in here, with people trying to come there. So, any other questions, thoughts about that? Again, so it's not that taxing to walk the Via Dolorosa. I mean, you're going uphill a section of it because the hill of Golgotha, right? It's outside the city. The elevation is going up. It's like a mile. It's not that bad, especially if you stop and take a moment at each of the things. It's a couple hours worth of time. Certainly, we were glad that we were able to trace those steps, because we do the crosswalk every year, and it gives us something to think on now as well. Did you have something, MJ? It looked like you were about to say something.
You answered that question, because it just seemed like it was not, in my mind, I pictured a longer distance.
Right. Well, so if we go back to we got to go back quite a ways. Got to go back to all the way to 3, 2, 1. Where's the map? There we go. So the Antonian fortress is north of the temple complex, right, of the Temple Mount. And so we're just going straight west across the end of the northernmost part of the old city, again, the city in the time of Jesus, out the gate, and then to a hill nearby. How nearby? Hard to say. The reason, and I think I mentioned this when we were talking about the Church of the Holy Sepulchre last week, the reason why there was a early, before Byzantine, an early Christian church on this site, a place where Christians were worshiping. It wouldn't have been much because, of course, they didn't have much before Constantine. And so after Jerusalem was destroyed in 70 AD, right, the Romans rebuilt this city eventually after the Bar Kokhba revolt, which was even worse. They rebuilt it as a pagan city. And they built a shrine, a shrine to the Roman gods over the spot where these pesky Christians were worshiping. When Constantine, after that, and Justinian and his mother and all those people get involved, then they're saying, this must have been the site where the Christians were worshiping, because that's why they built that pagan shrine there, to stick it to them. So they said, hey, this has got to be the right spot. I mean, if it's not the right spot, it's not far from the right spot. Again, the city has changed so dramatically in the last 2,000 years that other than tradition, there's really no way of knowing exactly, because the topography has changed, right, as things were destroyed and rebuilt and destroyed again down through the centuries. I talked about all those sieges that Jerusalem's been under. Many times it's been partly on fire or earthquakes and all that stuff. So that is the closest we can get. There's one other site for the tomb, and we're going to look at that in just a minute. We had one more self-guided tour. You can see this was our last night in Jerusalem, and so I had a whole different group of people that went back in, and I've already showed you the pictures from that, but I just figured why not. So this is the other site. This is called the Garden Tomb. The hill that looked like a skull to 19th century Protestants. So when the Protestants start coming in the 18th and 19th century to Jerusalem, they said to themselves, wait a minute, all of the sites, all of the holy sites, all of the spots, they're controlled by Orthodox and Catholic. That's not cool. so we got to find our own place. And so they were scouring, their early archaeologists, their early would-be archaeologists, they weren't all that well trained, some of them, were trying to find things, trying to find places that they could call their own. And one of them went outside the city walls, the modern city walls, outside of the ones built in the 17th century, just across the street, really. And they looked at this hill, and you can see what it looked like some years ago. And you're saying to yourself, does that look like a skull? I don't know. But the problem, of course, being that rock over 1,800 years, erosion, right, from the rain and the wind and the shifting of things. So no idea if the place of the skull was named that because it looked like a skull, or it was named that because that's where they executed people, right? The gospel doesn't tell us that. But these Protestants said, you know what, that works for us. We are about a half mile from the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, so a little bit further north, and maybe about a quarter mile from the old city walls. The weird thing about this is they've got these little pavilions where you can sit down, and their volunteer tour guides will talk about this hill, but while they're doing it, they have to talk over the sound of all of the city buses. Because the city of Jerusalem, some decades ago, decided this was a great spot for a bus interchange. And so there's like 12 buses pulling in and out constantly, which is just kind of odd, right, for that. But of course, in a city like this, you got to put stuff somewhere. One of the reasons why they thought, you know what, this could be a site is because in 1867, they found rock-cut tombs not far. Someone was doing some construction, and as you always do in the ancient Near East, you start digging, you find old stuff. They found rough-cut tombs in the rock, and again, it's not far. Right? So is the Church of the Holy Sepulchre the right site for the tomb, or is it out here at the Garden Tomb? I mean, we're a half mile away. Right? The Church of the Holy Sepulchre has tradition. That's what it has going for it. And you can't argue with that because we don't know what they were thinking when they said, this is the spot. Right? We don't know how sure they were. We don't know what had been handed down to them when they decided, let's build the church here. But the Garden Tomb Association, and we had a great volunteer guide from England. He was a fascinating guy. He comes down every year and spends a few weeks giving tours. And that's basically all of their tour guides are like that. They come from all over the world, and they just want to do it. The Garden Tomb is nice because it's a garden. Right? Of course, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is not a garden. It's in the middle of the modern old city. This is actually outside, and it still has that feel. And so this was a place that, as a group, we took communion. We did some of the readings, of course, of the burial and the resurrection and all of that. So let's take a look at what this tomb looks like. That's the entrance. You go inside, and basically you see it's what you would think. It's a small space carved out of the rock. So wherever the tomb of Jesus actually was, right, if it was this place or a little over there or a little over here, or maybe nobody knows where it was exactly, whichever way, it would have looked kind of like this. Okay? So what did they, of course, do with these tombs? They put the bodies wrapped in the tombs in this dry air, and they waited until it was just bones. And then they took the bones and put them in the family ossuary box that has the bones of many generations of their family in them. So this would have been a temporary place for the bodies to be stored. That was their burial practice back then. Okay? And the dry air, and that's why they're wrapped, and the spices and all of that is for that process. Not mummification like the Egyptians, not burning the bodies like the Scandinavians, not just burying them in the ground like most of Europe. This is what, again, it's influenced by the climate. And so you see in the garden tomb the kind of tomb where Jesus would have been. And questions, that's the last slide for Jerusalem. After that, we're going east down to the Dead Sea for the remainder. So what do we have? Yes, Amanda?
Did they tell you how long it would take for the body to lose all its flesh?
I'm sure I've read that at some point, but I don't remember off the top of my head. I mean, it's a process, but you're not in a hurry, right? I mean, you're not. You've done everything religiously that you need to do, right? You've treated the body with respect. You've done all of your mourning, and then when the time has passed, you take the bones. Which, again, Joseph says to the Israelites, right? When you leave here, take my bones. There wouldn't have been anything of him left unless he was mummified. We don't know about that because he lived like an Egyptian, so who knows? But that's the kind of thing. Much easier. And we've found a number of these ossuary boxes that have survived. They're, about that big. I don't know how many generations worth, because you're not using every bone. You're not putting every bone in there. And I'm sure there's a method to that. Not something I've studied more than I need to know.
I'm trying to put that together with the cemetery.
Right.
That you showed us in the initial.
On the Mount of Olives.
Is that just bones of generations and families?
That is an excellent question, and I didn't think to ask that at that point. Wait, what? Right. No, but that is a great thing. But it explains to you why in the Gospels they say a tomb in which no one had been placed. When normally you're thinking, well, yeah, because if someone had been placed in there, then it's full. Right? Then it's done. But that's not what these were for. They carved them in the rock. They put the stone in front so that the jackals, the hyena, or the whatever, the critters don't desecrate the body. And they allow time to do what time does, and then they come back later. And that's what they would have been doing with Jesus, right? Because the fact that it was Friday and sundown was coming and it was going to be a Sabbath, they had to place him in a nearby tomb, hence either the one at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre or the Garden Tomb or somewhere nearby that you could get to quickly. And then they would have come back later and taken his body elsewhere. That would have been the plan, of course. Didn't come out that way, but that would have been the plan. Yes?
The ossuary boxes give you a whole new meaning of sleeping with the fathers.
Oh, yeah.
I think that's where it came from.
Well, and they had, again, in the ancient world, in most cultures, they had a very much more developed understanding of the connection between themselves and their ancestors. Whereas, of course, most of us don't even know the name of our great-grandparents, right? They would have had a much better understanding of such things. It mattered a lot more to them than it does to us. So the next place that we went, and we actually didn't get a tour because the ruins of Jericho are not that well excavated. The one side is more of a tourist thing than anything else. But this just shows you the hills around Jericho. We're only just down the highway. Now it's a highway, which is much better than it used to be. But just down from Jerusalem, and now we're in the desert. You don't have to go more than a few miles east of Jerusalem over the Mount of Olives to start heading down towards the Jordan River Valley, and all of a sudden it's dry. All right, it's a dramatic shift. The kind of thing we don't normally see around here, right? And one of the things that was fascinating, and one of the things that people often go to Jericho for, is Jericho glass or Hebron glass that's made in this part of the West Bank, has been since the time of the Phoenicians, so this goes back to before the time of Christ. They melt local mineral additives into the mixture, the sand that's molten, to give it that color. My wife bought a couple. I'd show them to you, but she gave them to her mother, so they're in Traverse City, so you can't see them right now. But very nice. And of course, they were glad to see our tour group come because they did very well from us, as most of these spots. We only stopped. One of the things that and I guess now that the thought occurs to me, our tour guides don't use your credit card anywhere except for where I take you, because I know the merchants there, and I know that your numbers aren't going to get stolen. And so we followed that advice. We used cash anywhere that we weren't a spot that he knew. But again, that's a very Middle Eastern thing. Relationship. I know these guys, they know me. I bring a tour here every week, that kind of thing. It's not surprising at all. Outside was one of my favorites, my wife's favorite things, and that's Sam the Kissing Camel. And I say he's infamous because I talked to somebody else who'd been to Jericho, and they mentioned Sam the Kissing Camel, and I was like, this guy gets around. And I didn't use the picture of him actually putting his mouth on the side of my wife's face, because that's gross. But that camel will kiss you, and of course, the local man that brings the camel down here when the tourist shows up, he's making money off of the photo ops and off of people give him tips and little rides around the parking lot and all of that stuff, just like you're at the circus. So we didn't get a lot of pictures there, but the Dead Sea is something else, and that is us in the Dead Sea, and nobody is making any effort to swim because you can't sink. One of it was May, and it was so hot. I walked I didn't have my sandals with me, so I walked barefoot from the water to the showers, because you want to get that salt off of you. And oh my gosh, my feet felt like they were burning. It was so hot, that sand. And that's May, all right? This is a very hot place. It's a desert. It's below sea level by 1,400 feet. So the dirt on the edge of the water is the lowest dry ground in the world. It's not the lowest place, because the bottom of the ocean is the lowest land, but the lowest dry land in the world is the shore of the Dead Sea. It's lower than it used to be because the Dead Sea has receded by almost half of its volume since the 1930s. The government of Israel is desperately trying to figure out how to counteract that, because it would be a massive blow to the ecosystem, migratory birds and all of the stuff that would come with it if the Dead Sea were to dry up completely. They're actually talking about bringing water in from the Red Sea, ocean water, salty, so it wouldn't really matter, right? The Dead Sea is 9 times as salty as the ocean. So take the amount of salt that's in the typical ocean and go 9 times as much, and that's how salty it is, which is why it's so buoyant, why you can't sink down into it. The Jordan River is flowing into it every day, but nothing ever flows out. We've got the hills on both sides, and now we've got elevation to the south, so the river has nowhere to go. And so all it does is evaporate. It's no different than the Great Salt Lake out in Utah, the exact same kind of thing. We've got some river water flowing in, and it's got nowhere to go, so you end up with salt water just over time. Again, it's fresh water coming in from the Jordan River, but fresh water doesn't have no salt in it, right? It has some, and if you evaporate it over 10,000 years, you got a lot of salt. And so people have, throughout human history, been coming to the Dead Sea to get salt, because salt in the ancient world was very valuable for preserving meat and fish and all sorts of other things, because there was no refrigeration. And so easy, ready sources of salt were always valuable, and this has been one of those. Notice how much it has receded. All of this on the left, 50 years ago, was underwater. You see these sinkholes. That was the best picture I had. we were up on the highway up above it. These are massive sinkholes because when the water recedes, some of that soil is got all of that salt in it. And so when the winter rains come in Jerusalem, they come cascading down the canyons. And in Qumran, I have a picture showing where the water rushes down. I mean, this is a dry place, but when those rains come, you get flash floods. And when those flash floods hit this soil that's so salty, they dissolve that salt once more, and the whole thing just, boom, goes flying in a sinkhole. And so there are towns around the Dead Sea where house after house is now condemned because the foundations are no good because of this. It's a serious ecological issue that the government, if they weren't dealing with everything else, would, and no doubt people are still working on this because it's a disaster decades in the making. They've got to take less water out of the Jordan River. That's the end of it, but that water is so precious, it's hard to. Questions about the Dead Sea itself. On the east side, we've got Jordan. On the west side, we've got the West Bank, which of course is disputed territory controlled by Israel. But all right, what's on the shore of the Dead Sea is some interesting stuff. We've got two main spots left to look at, but I've got plenty of pictures because they're quite cool. And the first is Qumran National Park. Until the 1950s, right? Nobody knew anything about Qumran other than the fact that there were ruins here. It was not that big a deal until they found something here. All right, this is now a national park. We are 1 mile west of the northwest shore of the Dead Sea and 6 miles south of Jericho. All right, Jericho has been inhabited for thousands and thousands of years, right? There are some springs there. There's some palms there. It's not far from the Jordan River. We're going towards the Badlands. We're going into a much more desolate area when you go to Qumran. You can see how dry it is in the distance on the hills. It was occupied by a Jewish mystic separatist sect. That's a lot of things, right? There were many, and one of the things that is a misnomer, a misunderstanding about first century Judaism, right? The Judaism of Jesus' day. It was not a monolith. There were, again, Protestant, Orthodox, Catholic. They had their own versions between the Sadducees and the Pharisees, groups that did not see eye to eye and saw a lot of things differently. Well, the Essenes were a group that said, forget all of you all. This whole thing is so messed up that we're out. And they basically said, we're going to go live in the desert. And they actually had groups all over Palestine, all over Israel, where they recruited from and they had connections. But their main group was out here on the shore of the Dead Sea. They figured, we go here, people will leave us alone, right? Why would anyone else come here? And so they existed there for a long time on the shore of the Sea of Galilee, up through the time of Christ. They were here when the war broke out with Rome, and eventually, of course, the Romans destroyed the settlement because the Romans didn't care that they were separatists and didn't, they were like, so. At that point in the war, it was, anyone was fair game. And so they have uncovered their settlement, they've dug it up, and you can see the remains of their various buildings. In 1947, Bedouin shepherds, and we saw Bedouin encampments off the highway on the way between Jerusalem and down to Jericho. The Bedouins are an interesting limbo in this fight between the Palestinians and the Jews over this land, because the Bedouins are like a third party that are like, well, leave us out of it, how do we fit in? Because they've been shepherding sheep and camels and whatnot on these hills for time immemorial. And it's an unfortunate thing that all of this conflict is happening, because it's affecting them as well. But a Bedouin shepherd, a young boy, was throwing rocks into a cave, because when you're shepherding sheep, what else do you do during the day, right? They just wander around. There's not a lot to do. And heard that noise that you would recognize of pottery smashing, and said to himself, And so they climbed up, they clambered into the cave, and found a whole bunch of sealed jars, which was very important because that protected what was inside them, took something from it to his father, who took it to an antiquities dealer, yada, yada, yada. Eventually, someone said, wait a minute, we've got something here. And what we have, of course, is the Dead Sea Scrolls. The Dead Sea Scrolls are one of the top whatever, pick your top number, archaeological finds of all of human history. Because until, and this is my history of the Bible seminar, shameless plug for one of my other ones, until the Dead Sea Scrolls were found, we did not have a copy of the Old Testament that predated the time of Christ. Because, again, Jerusalem was destroyed in 70. Most of the copies were destroyed, and the things that Jews did when a scroll became so bad that you couldn't use it anymore was they buried it. Just like Boy Scouts burning old flags, right? They didn't preserve them and save them. So we didn't have anything that was older than 1000 AD. You find the Dead Sea Scrolls, they predate the time of Christ, and you have confirmation that the text of the Old Testament that Jesus was reading is the same that we have today, because there weren't big differences between that old, the text that was hidden in jars for 2,000 years, right? It was nice and safe and nobody changed it for 2,000 years. So it's a huge thing for biblical archaeology in the text of the Old Testament, and that is one of the caves. They eventually found a number of caves and a whole bunch of jars. They found things like grocery lists. They found things the Essenes wrote about their way of life and their rules, and they found huge sections of Old Testament scrolls, everything but the Song of Solomon and Esther. Song of Solomon because these guys were pretty much like Puritans, and that erotic poetry just wasn't working for them, and Esther because the sacred name of God is not in the book of Esther. And perhaps that's why they didn't want a copy of Esther. We're not 100% sure, but those things tend to make sense. So the Dead Sea Scrolls, very important. You look on the hill and you can see the discoloration, just that white thing, and then you see how it runs down through there. And so when those flash floods come through, they come gushing down the hillsides every year during the winter rains, taking, of course, sand and dirt and everything with it, which is an opportunity. If you're living out here in the desert, you need to capture that water in a cistern and save it for the rest of the year because you're not getting much more. But normally, most of it just flows into the Dead Sea, and that's the end of it. Looking out from Qumran, you can see the Dead Sea in the distance. That is their cemetery, and the rocks that they placed over bodies. Again, a different method, but they're a different kind of people, living in a pretty harsh place. And then once again, the Dead Sea from Qumran, with the hills of modern Jordan in the distance. When we talk about Ruth, the Moabitess, she came from the other side of the Jordan River in those hills somewhere. That's where her people were from, the people of Moab, to the southeast, the east and a little bit south of the Dead Sea, somewhere in there. And so when she comes into the story, right, and becomes part of the line of David, and eventually, of course, the line of Jesus, that is a big deal in the text. It mentions that she is a Moabitess again and again and again. That would have been the hills right across there. Modern day Jordan would have been ancient Moab. Questions about Qumran and the Dead Sea Scrolls and all of that before we move to our final main one, which of course is Masada, and we've got lots and lots of pictures of Masada.
What do they figure the years are that that's in existence?
The settlement at Qumran, I don't know if they have an exact starting date. It was certainly well established before the birth of Christ. They had been there for generations, building up their community. And then, of course, the Romans destroyed them somewhere around 70 AD. And there's plenty of speculation as to what influence there may have been on John the Baptist by the community, because he was out here thereabouts. Maybe. You never know. We're reconstructing them based on the fragments of scrolls that we have left, which, is not a lot. No one would have heard of them if not for the Dead Sea Scrolls, right? They would have been one of those things that only someone who got into deep study of first century Judaism might come across something about the Essenes. But the Dead Sea Scrolls mean, now everybody knows who they are, because it's a huge, huge deal. All right? Lastly, and I mentioned earlier that there were two places that I wanted to go in Israel, and one of them was Masada. Wherever else we went, I said, I need to go to Masada. It was an optional day trip, but everybody in our group took it because, why not? It's a once in a lifetime kind of thing. So Masada is a rock mesa. It's a rock that is basically higher than the surrounding land. Of course, erosion and everything and earthquakes have made these kind of outcroppings. On the eastern edge of the Judean desert, overlooking the Dead Sea. You can see we're a little bit further from the Dead Sea than Qumran was, because we're on the road here, and that's how far it was. So we're a couple miles from the Dead Sea. Between 37 and 31 BC, Herod the Great built two palaces, because one wasn't enough, two palaces on the top of it and fortified it. Why? Because Herod said, this thing can go south on me at some point. All right? He's not a Jew. He married into the Hasmonean dynasty, but he is not a member of this community. He is ruling because he gave the Romans a lot of gold. And so they made him a puppet king. And he said to himself, if this goes south, I need a place where I can go until the riot, the civil war, whatever dies down. And he found Masada, and he built that up there and said, and unfortunately, he never used it. No one in his family ever used it as a place of refuge. It ended up being Jewish rebels fleeing the Romans that famously fought here. But still, Herod built it for his own personal use, which again, he built, right, the temple structure, Caesarea Maritima. We saw all the different things that Herod built. The guy spent a lot of time doing building projects. This is the 1,300-foot eastern slope. All right, and you can tell I took this picture from the cable car entrance, because the cable car is the easy way to go up. You can take the snake trail, which is the hard way. But if you take the snake trail, there are certain days when the park rangers won't let anyone climb the trail, because they don't want them to die. And if you are going to climb the snake trail, it is recommended you leave well before dawn so that you can get to the top well before noon. Because in the summer, it's not unusual for the temperature to be 109, 110, and you say to yourself, well, it's a dry heat. And it certainly is a dry heat, but it is very hot. Again, we were there in May. I think we left the hotel at like 7:05. I mean, we were early. We got there at like 8:15, and we're up on Masada by 9. We came back down at about 12 when other groups were going up. It was so hot. It was and I was like, stinks for you guys. Now, fortunately, the Park Service takes water up to the top, so that tourists can actually get water. Otherwise, they'd have heat stroke victims all day long, right? They'd be evacuating people. So that is the eastern slope. And that's not a bad place to have a fortress, right? Because if you're up there, good luck anyone attacking that. So we took the easy way up. I looked at that and I said, I'm an ultra runner. I love trails. Man, I would love to do that. Just to say I ran up Masada. but I would have to have a place to get a shower afterwards because I would have been soaked, right, and exhausted, so I didn't do it. This is looking down at the park headquarters, and you can see the snake trail coming up. You see the little square? When the Romans besieged Masada, they built a wall of circumvallation. They built a wall around it, and we'll see a better picture of that later. And then every one of their camps, they built a fortification around. That's the Roman way. Every night when they're on the march and they stop, they build a temporary fortress around the camp. That's just rule number one when you're a Roman legion. And so because this is the desert, and not much happens here, you can still see the remains of the walls they built around their camp. Now, they were here for a while, because they put the fortress under siege, and it took a long time. But you can still see those ruins, and you can see the Dead Sea. Again, smaller than it used to be, but still we're a little ways away. And that's a better look at the hike. Anybody up for the hike? No? No? Okay. People do, right? People come here because they want to say, I want to hike Masada, right? It's like hiking Mount Rainier or something like that. People just want to do it. But it is a hot hike. That is for sure. So you get to the top, and we start to hear the story. In 66 AD, Jewish rebels, they were known as Sicarii, which meant they were an extremist splinter group among the rebels. They were rebels that didn't get along with the rest of the rebels because they were more extreme. Think of them in that term. They seized control of the fortress. And as refugees fled from Jerusalem, not just any refugees, but fellow Sicarii, they welcomed them, and so the number of people grew dramatically that were on this mountaintop, the top of this mesa. And you're saying to yourself, how can they possibly stay up there very long? Well, Herod planned this as a place where he could stay for months, years if he needed to. So he made sure the place was prepared, and we'll see where their water came from eventually. In 73 AD, General Lucius Flavius Silva brought the 10th Legion to Masada and laid siege to it, building a circumvallation wall around it, and we will show you pictures of that. That was a lot of work, but again, the Romans didn't shy away from that kind of thing, in part because they used slave labor. Using slave labor, many of them captured Jews in the war. The Romans built a 375-foot earthen ramp. When we get done walking around the place, I'll show you some amazing pictures of that. And they pushed a siege tower up a 375-foot earthen ramp. I don't know how they managed that, because that seems like a lot of work. But they did it, only to find that they didn't need the siege tower because everybody inside was dead. Only 2 women and 5 children were left alive. They actually have found evidence of how they drew lots on who would kill who and who would be left at the end and would kill themselves, because they didn't want to kill themselves, of course, and commit suicide. And 960 men, women, and children committed suicide rather than being enslaved or crucified by the Romans, as they would have all been. Which, of course, makes this site the modern Israeli version of Gettysburg or the Iwo Jima Memorial or something of that nature. A place where soldiers and school children go in order to get inspired to defend their homeland. So that's very interesting how over time that story turns, because of course they were failures, right? They rebelled against Rome and it did not go well. They got Jerusalem and the temple destroyed. They got the hundreds or tens of thousands of Jews killed. The Romans crushed them, lay siege to their last stronghold, and then they all killed themselves. And you're saying, how are we memorializing this? Well, we do because they would rather die free than live, right? And that is the thing that makes this such a symbolic place in Israel today. Extensive excavation and restoration work began in the 1960s. You see the little black line that runs on the wall. You see it goes across there and it goes over that rock and down around this way and weaves its way. That is the line that the archaeologists put so that you would know everything below is as it was when we started digging. Everything above is wall that we rebuilt with the stones that were scattered all around here. So they've rebuilt parts of Masada as they believe it would have been based on the part of the, it's not hard to figure out, well, there's a wall right here, and all of these rocks must have been on it, so we'll just put them back on the wall. I mean, it's pretty straightforward. But they left that as a testament to future generations to see what had been restored versus what was original. One of the reasons I wanted to go to Masada is just the views are amazing. From up there. This is looking east on the top toward the Dead Sea, and then turning around and looking south across the length of the mesa. It's a fairly good-sized space there, which in Herod's day had a lot of buildings, right? Residences, storehouses, homes for his servants and whatnot. All sorts of things were there because he built them. You can see that they put some new plaster on there. Of course, the plaster's not original. And tried to show you what the inside of one of these buildings would have looked like. They built the top of it and then put a roof on because, of course, the roof wasn't still there. But as with all of these ancient sites that we've looked at, extremely colorful. Again, Herod was not going to have a palace that didn't look good. So it would have been highly decorated and very beautiful at the time. This is looking northwest, and you can see the remnants of the Roman wall and yet another Roman legionary fort. So they built this wall all the way around, and then it goes down around and goes all the way around. Miles and miles of wall. Why build the wall? Why build a wall at the base of the fortress? Nobody's getting out. Nobody's sneaking out. Everybody in here we're capturing or killing. And so they did this. They did the same thing, Julius Caesar did the same thing to the Gauls in France. Built a wall, they were in a fortress, he built a wall around their fortress and laid siege to them. When a relief army came, he built a wall around his wall, and the Romans were in the donut, in between the walls, and they waited until they starved out the guys in the middle. Again, the Romans were not kidding when they went to war. And so you're saying to yourself, that's an awful lot of work. I mean, can't you see anyone coming down the mountainside? But they were like, no, we're not taking chances. And so they built this wall, they built these fortifications all the way around it. No one can get in to help them, no one's getting back out. Now the eastern side, the western side, you can see is a lot closer. Not nearly as steep as the eastern side, and that will be the reason why the ramp is on that side. But before we get there, from the top you look down and you see what is known as the Lower Palace. Built right into the side of the hill is one of the two palaces, and it's quite extraordinary. That is looking west towards the ramp. We will get a better view in a minute, but you can see the steps, right? All these steps leading down to the lower palace. They wouldn't have been there. They're not original, right? I don't know. They would have had a different way to get from up above down to there. But I said to myself, our group was sort of taking a break in the shade here, and I said to myself, he's not taking these people down to the lower palace. We got a bunch of people in their 70s and that struggle with steps. I'm like, we're not going down there. I'm like, I got to go down there. So I'm like, I'll be back. And he's like, okay. And so I took off. It was like 180 steps. I forget how many steps it was. I counted as I went. I'm trying not to go fast because I don't want to be soaked in sweat because it's hot and we're going to be up here yet a while. But I went all the way down there because I needed to see it, and it was definitely worth it. This is the lower palace. The terrace of the lower palace. There's some better shots of what's left. They've excavated some of this. I'm assuming that they built it here for whatever breeze you get and some shade on the from above blocking the sun part of the day. You can see that it was quite ornate at the time, and Herod must have spent a ton of money and a whole lot of slave labor building this palace. And then you turn around and you look and see how much lower we are from the top where the lower palace is. And this is the best view. So this is the building that Herod would have used. And no doubt he came here from time to time. It was a refuge, but it was also a place to go as one of his many places, one of his palaces. Like a rich person with 5 homes, you got to visit them all at some point. But imagine how much work it took to build this 2,000 years ago in this climate. The hauling and the chiseling and the mortar work, my goodness. The workmen deserve some sort of recognition or some sort of medals. And you can see some of it was preserved well enough that you can still see some, because this part had been, after it was destroyed, this had been buried in all of that, and now that it's been excavated. But you can imagine how glorious this looked during the time of Herod. Whoops, I didn't mean to zoom. Let's unzoom. Go to the next slide. Now, how do they survive at the top? There is a system, there was at the time, a working system of 12 cisterns. We talked about the flash floods, right? When those flash floods came, they built channels to direct that water into 12 cisterns. So the water rushing down the hillside during the winter flash floods would end up in these cisterns. And they would be there for the rest of the years, and then they would use donkeys to go down this mountain path to the cistern, because the cistern's got to be lower, right, so the water flows into it. So they go down these little paths with water jugs on them, with probably some poor guy whose job that is to go down there with a donkey, fill them up with water, take them back up top for everyone there. That's how they were able to survive until the Romans built the siege ramp, was because they had all that water that was naturally filled in the cisterns. You have to work. As long as the channels are there, you've got a full year's worth. Had the siege been prolonged, no doubt the Romans would have figured out how to destroy the channels to keep the cisterns from being refilled, but they would have had enough to last for that year. And I saw that some people wrote graffiti inside there, and you're just like, come on, man. Climb into this 2,000-year-old cistern and write, Bob was here, and smack them upside the head. So what kind of luxury are we talking about? Well, there was a Roman-style bath on the top of Masada. Now, during the summer, you don't need a heated bath because it is very hot. But during the winter, this is a cold place. And they heated the water, and the water was underneath the floor, so it was basically like a sauna. The Romans invented it. It's quite the thing, and you can see the little pillars that held up the floor. And so in between those pillars would have been hot water back in the day that would have flowed around there and made this into just a extremely luxurious bath. There were baths like this in Rome, in Corinth, in Athens, that the Romans built them everywhere for the people. And of course, this is one that Herod had built for his own appreciation. There you see the earthen ramp. We're getting closer to it. That is not a small number of buckets of dirt to build this, right? Because as you're building the ramp, it's going to spread out to the sides, right? And so you've got to kind of build it up like this. You can't make it too steep because the dirt will just run away. And you're going up 375 feet. No doubt that they used Jewish captured rebels as slave labor so that the people at the top wouldn't kill them. Right? They're not going to shoot fellow Jews that are building the ramp and kill them. Roman soldiers aren't going to have to do that. But the defenders knew their days were numbered, right? The months that went by as they're building this thing, every day it's getting a little closer, a little closer, a little closer. And so they have councils and they have arguments and they say, what do we do, right? How do we stop this? What can we do? And eventually they say, we got nothing. So they committed mass suicide instead. This is a building that they turned when the rebels came into their synagogue. It wasn't a synagogue in Herod's plans because he didn't need a synagogue, because he didn't care about such things. But they turned it into a synagogue. And you can see the benches where they would have sat. And so the rebels, for those couple of years that they controlled Masada, worshipped, on this mountaintop. And as their days were numbered, no doubt, those must have been interesting times. This is looking through the whole, right down at the ramp. All right? And you can see that there is a modern path that comes up to the side, right? Off in the distance, the buses, those were all Israeli school children. I mentioned that the elementary kids walk Hezekiah's tunnel, right? High schoolers come here. Pretty much all of them. They come to Masada, they take a day trip, they go up there and someone tells them, what their ancestors experienced. And so there were a ton of Israeli high schoolers walking around up here. And they park on this side and walk up the hill. They're young. It's easier that way. But it's much easier to walk up the 375 feet of the eastern slope than the 1,300 feet of the western slope than the eastern slope, right? I mean, that's a lot shorter. And so they were there learning about the history of their people. Interestingly enough, from the 5th to the 7th century, there were Byzantine monks who occupied Masada. It was, after the Romans were done with it, it was a ruin, right? They destroyed the place, the rebellion was over, and nobody was here. It was basically unoccupied for centuries. And then some Byzantine monks said, where can we go where everyone will leave us alone? And we can be all by ourselves. And someone thought of Masada. And so they climbed up on top and they said, hey, and they used some of the rubble and whatnot and they built a church here. And you can see that our guide told us all of the rocks in that weird pattern. You're like, is that art? What is that? That was a way of making it so that the plaster on the walls would hold better. So that it would have a surface to adhere to. And so you're like, oh, interesting. And so for a couple of centuries, there were monks on top of this mountain, minding their own business and being, of course, away from everyone else. And they built a mosaic tile floor on the church, in the church, which, of course, reminds us of so many of the other mosaic tile floors. I wish that was something that was still a thing, because those ancient mosaic tiles are just beautiful. They're a ton of work, no doubt, as well. I'm almost to the end of the slides. Questions about Masada, about the fortress, about the history of it? Yes. They didn't commit suicide. We don't know. They were probably hiding. They were probably two moms and their kids, one would imagine, if it was 2 women and 5 kids. And they just, and so they're the only known survivors.
I don't know where I read this. There's something about they wanted to have at least one survivor to tell the tale. Is that true or just speculation?
Well, who knows, right? It's hard to reconstruct that kind of thing. We have what Josephus wrote, but of course he's got an angle in his writing. We have what archaeology tells us, and no doubt the survivors told a tale, but whether or not that was accurate depends on how much the truth meant to them in that respect. But so. It's an amazing place, to stand there, to look out at the Dead Sea, to look out and say, someone built a fortress up here. And you're thinking, oh, that's a lot of work, because this is a desolate, inaccessible place. Of course, one man built a palace, and then some other people turned it into a fortress. And then the Romans built that ramp. It's just incredible to go there. So we're going to actually end a little bit early tonight. It looks like the last third of the slides were quicker than the first 2/3. And so I wanted to take a few minutes to talk about the group a little bit. That is our tour guide, Mike. He was awesome. He's a Palestinian Christian, which means he has family in the West Bank, which means that this is a very dangerous time for them. And he has a little microphone on. He called it his whisper, and all of the tour guides do. Because you can imagine that if you're standing at one of these churches and there's 8 different tours going on in 6 different languages, shouting to be heard is not something you can do. And inside the churches, you can't shout. It's not polite. And so all of us had these little headphone things hanging around our neck. What's what those little blue things are that we all happen to have. And at first you're thinking, I can hear him. I don't need a microphone. But it makes an awful lot of sense. Because it also helps you keep track of your group when there are tours going like this in busy places. And he can say, over here, I'm waving my hand so for the people that we're trying not to lose in our group, which every once in a while was a bit of a challenge. But definitely, if you're going to go to the Holy Land, find a reputable tour company and go with a group. Because there's something about being, especially if it's a group of people you know or like-minded people, because you can learn a lot together. But also, the tour guides know how to get into everything. I can't imagine trying to figure out all of this on our own, the parking, the tickets, and the hours, when you can get here versus when you can get there. It's quite incredible. And I certainly wouldn't want to drive around Jerusalem. It was frightening watching our bus hurtle around these tight corners, zipping between, around motorcycles pulling in front of us. It was crazy. We had an awesome tour bus driver, too. And that is our whole group in front of the Mount of Olives. A lot of us from American Baptist churches in Pennsylvania and Delaware, and then some friends from over near Delaware from some other churches as well. It was an awesome group. And you can see, we had plenty of people that are in that retirement age, and they managed to do it. So never too late if you're mobile at all to go visit. And then I wanted to end with some takeaways. Takeaways about visiting the Holy Land, right? And I've already jumped into these a little bit. Number one, a week on the ground is barely enough. It takes 2 days to get there and back, right? But spending a week is the bare minimum. If you're going to say to yourself, I've only got 3 days and I want to see all of Israel, you're kidding yourself. Don't try. Either spend 3 days in Galilee or 3 days in Jerusalem, right? Because you will not. That's like going to Disney World and saying, we're going to be there 2 days, but I want to go to all 5 parks. Don't do that. You're not going to enjoy any of it. 3 days is a minimum for Jerusalem. 3 days is a minimum for Galilee. Thankfully, we had 7 days, and so that left us a little bit of room in between in order to see things like Masada. But that is definitely something to consider. A trusted tour guide and a trusted tour company is a huge benefit. Number 3, expect to eat kosher and for things to shut down on the Sabbath, because that's the way it is everywhere. You don't go to a restaurant and order a cheeseburger. It isn't happening, all right, because they don't put beef with cheese on anything. So don't do that, and expect that's going to be the menu everywhere. All right? Not that every modern Jew cares about the kosher laws that much, because some of them aren't observant, but the ones that do care a lot, and so that is the rule. They got kosher kitchens and kosher menus, and everything is closed on the Sabbath. So what did we do on the Sabbath? We went from Galilee to Jerusalem, because what else can you do? We went to Bethlehem, because that's in the West Bank and those were Christian sites, and so we could go there. But everything else is going to be closed on the Sabbath. It is physically challenging, but as I said, we had people in their 70s, people that you could tell that walking was hard for them. They managed it. And so number 5, and this is for the people sitting here and people that ever watch this online, if you dream of going, then just go. Figure out a way. Make it happen. Don't say, oh, I wish I ever went, because you'll feel bad about it. So let's talk about the Holy Land itself. What did I learn about this land from being there in person? Number one, and I've mentioned this, the church is indeed global. We saw Nigerians, Brazilians, people from India, people from South Korea, people from everywhere. And as I've mentioned a number of times, most of the church doesn't look like us anymore, and most of the church doesn't speak English. So when you go to the Holy Land and you look around and you're like, yeah, we're just one among many. Because sometimes in America, the church, we start to say, oh, how we look at things and what we think of things, that must be what it is. But there's a whole big church out there. And you go to the Holy Land and you realize that. And I've mentioned this a number of times. Older is lower. Sometimes 30, 40 feet lower to get down to the ancient level. Whether that's 2,000 years ago, 3,000 years ago, or more. That's not the way we think here, but that's certainly the way it is over there. Thirdly, traditional sites are just that, they're traditions. But our faith does not rest on whether or not the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is in the right place. Our faith rests on whether or not there was indeed an empty tomb. Not where that tomb was, so that we can go there and worship today. So enjoy the traditions, right? Go to the sites, appreciate them for what they are. But if archaeology proves, and even definitively someday, that no, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and the Garden Tomb are both wrong. They're not the right. It's actually another 100 yards south, or whatever from here. Who cares? It doesn't change anything. Because that's not what our faith is in, never has been. And then lastly, sites sacred to all three faiths, Jews, Muslims, and Christians, are sometimes literally across the street from each other. And sometimes they're the same place when it's the Dome of the Rock and the Temple Mount, right? It has been possible in this history, going back to the advent, to the beginning of Islam in the 700s, it has been possible for all three faiths to live in peace. And there have been times when they have not, in various directions and various people to blame for that. If it has been done, it can be done. Hard to say how long this present conflict is going to last. Hard to say when things will get back to whatever normal is on the other side of this. But we know that it's possible, that everyone can come to Jerusalem, for example, and worship there and freely visit the places. We know it's possible. We also know that human beings in history have made it impossible from time to time. And that's the danger that right now that this war will spread and engulf Jerusalem. I've only seen one issue in and around Jerusalem. That was at a bus station in East Jerusalem, in the modern city, where some shootings happened, unfortunately, a few weeks ago. But inside the old city, there hasn't been any reports of violence to this point. A lot of them in the West Bank, though, unfortunately. A lot of people have been killed in the West Bank since this started as well, in places that we drove through, by Jericho, by Bethlehem, etc. So, any closing questions, thoughts from you guys? Otherwise, I will wrap it up there a few minutes early and you can brave the snow. I don't know, maybe there's a foot of snow out there. We've been in here an hour. You never know. Or maybe there's still none. I don't know. That's the way with snow forecasts. All right, then we will bring it to a close there. Thank you for coming.
Thank you.
Yes, you're welcome. Finish on that. Oops. Come on, push the button. There we go. Ouch.